The Application Lifecycle Risk Management Podcast. Episode 12. Defining Done. A couple of weeks ago, I mentioned definition of done, which many of my readers may have never heard before. The phrase definition of done comes out of the Agile movement, but there's no reason why it needs to stay there. In fact, I would argue that many of the problems we have in the software industry are because most organizations only have one definition of done. If we ship this today, can we make money? When the Agile people talk about definition of done, what they ultimately mean is, if we were to ship this product today and someone were to inspect what we've done, would we be embarrassed? Definition of done is about the quality of the code. When thinking about the definition of done, here are some items that you might consider. Does the code meet the requirements of the user story? Now, this is the most obvious. Of course, for this to work, you have to have a user story that is specific enough for you to answer this question. Has all of the documentation that the organization requires been updated? Now, this one can fall through the cracks easily because documentation is the least favorite activity of a programmer. But it isn't necessarily a programmer activity. Remember, an ideal team has all of the skills it needs. So, if you have a documentation requirement, be it an ISO requirement or simple end-user documentation telling them how to use the software, your team should have someone on it that can produce that documentation. Does the code have a reasonable level of unit test? I say reasonable here because the principle is high code coverage where we need it. To try to aim for some metric that will cause us to write tests where we don't need them, that's just foolish. By combining a reasonableness level with code reviews, I think we can hit this target without setting an unrealistic, arbitrary limit. Do all of the unit tests succeed? Now, you'd think this one would be obvious. You have tests, you should be running them every time the code changes. But I've seen situations where tests sit in version control and never get run. Run your test. Is the code covered by system-level tests? Once again, this one should be obvious. Just because you have unit tests doesn't mean the system works. The main problem with the federal healthcare website that went live in the United States recently is because no one made sure all of the parts worked together. And don't leave this to manual testing. There are many ways of testing at this level that you can automate. And once again, run all your system tests. Has the code been reviewed by one other programmer? If there isn't at least one other programmer on your team that understands what you've done, you aren't done. I could, and probably will, write a whole post about that sometime. Have coding conventions been observed throughout the code? There are a number of tools out there that check coding conventions. For C#, I like ReSharper. JSHint is what I prefer for JavaScript. And there's FXCop built into Visual Studio. Pick a standard, find a way to automatically verify the code meets the standard, and make sure nothing gets put into version control that doesn't meet the standard. Has the code passed some level of complexity threshold? I've talked about code complexity before. Just go read that post. Is there any known code duplication? Again, there are tools for this. Find one and use it. And when you compile, are there warnings? Compiling without warnings is something else I've already talked about. For other places to talk about definition of done, go to my website and check out the links at the bottom of the web post.